I thought I knew everything about my quiet, polite neighbor Henry, until that knock on my door in the middle of the night. What he confessed shattered every illusion I had about him and his perfect marriage. But just as I began to process his shocking words, his wife, Samantha, appeared in the doorway. And trust me, what happened next turned my world upside down. You won't believe where this story goes. Henry was the last person I ever expected to bring chaos into my life. He lived just next door, a man of few words but always polite. Every morning he would wave as he mowed his perfectly manicured lawn, and every evening I'd see him and his wife, Samantha, enjoying quiet dinners through their softly lit window. They seemed like the ideal couple, the kind of people who lived a life free of complications. I wasn't close to Henry or Samantha, but we shared the occasional small talk. Nice weather today, isn't it? Or did you catch the game last night? The usual neighborly pleasantries. If you'd asked me before that night, I'd have said their life was picture perfect. And honestly, I envied them a little. They had what seemed like stability, harmony, a bond that many people could only dream of. My life, on the other hand, was ordinary to a fault. I'd come home from work, change into something comfortable, and scroll through my phone until I fell asleep. My days were a quiet rhythm of predictability, and I liked it that way. I wasn't looking for drama. I wasn't looking for complications. But sometimes life throws you into the middle of a storm without warning. That night started like any other. The hum of the neighborhood was calm. The occasional dog bark or car passing by was the soundtrack to my uneventful evening. I had no idea how drastically things were about to change. When I heard the knock at the door, I thought it might be a package delivery or maybe a neighbor needing sugar or a tool. I never expected to see Henry standing there, looking nervous and out of place. His voice trembled when he asked, "Can I talk to you for a minute?" His hands were shoved deep into his jacket pockets, and his eyes darted around like he was afraid someone might see him. I couldn't ignore the look of distress on his face, so I invited him in. What followed wasn't a normal chat between neighbors. As Henry began to speak, I realized his life wasn't as perfect as I had thought, and whatever storm he was battling inside was about to pull me in too. As Henry sat on my couch, fidgeting with his hands, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He was clearly on edge, his shoulders tense and his gaze unfocused. I tried to keep the conversation light, thinking maybe he just needed to vent about work or some minor frustration. But it wasn't long before I realized this wasn't a simple neighborly chat. "I don't even know where to start," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Lately, I feel like my life is unraveling." I nodded, trying to encourage him to open up without pushing too hard. "What do you mean?" I asked cautiously. He hesitated, his eyes darting to the door as if he was debating whether to bolt. Then he let out a heavy sigh and leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Samantha and I, things haven't been great for a while. I don't know if it's me or her or both of us, but something's missing." The weight of his words hung in the air. I wasn't sure how to respond. It wasn't uncommon to hear about marital struggles, but the way he spoke felt different. There was something deeper, something unsaid, and it made my stomach twist with unease. "Have you talked to her about it?" I asked, trying to steer the conversation in a constructive direction. He shook his head. "It's not that simple. She wouldn't understand. And, well, there's more to it." That's when I noticed the shift in his tone. His voice grew quieter, more hesitant, and his eyes avoided mine. It was like he was on the verge of saying something he wasn't sure he should. My mind raced, trying to piece together what could possibly be going on. Was he having an affair? Was he in trouble? The possibilities were endless, and none of them felt good. "I've been struggling with feelings I can't control," he finally admitted, his words barely above a whisper. "Feelings I shouldn't have." A chill ran down my spine. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. I didn't know what to say, but I didn't have to. Henry continued, his words tumbling out like he'd been holding them in for far too long. "I think about things I shouldn't. About people I shouldn't," he said, his voice trembling. "And lately I can't stop thinking about you." The confession hit me like a punch to the gut. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My mind reeled as I tried to process what he'd just said. This was my neighbor, a married man, sitting in my living room and confessing this. "Henry," I said, my voice shaking slightly, "you can't mean that." But the look in his eyes told me he did. He nodded slowly, his expression a mixture of shame and desperation. "I know it's wrong. I know it doesn't make sense. But I needed to tell you. I couldn't keep it bottled up anymore." I stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest. The words felt heavy, suffocating. How had I missed the signs? Was I blind, or was he just that good at hiding it? And then, as if the situation couldn't get any worse, there was a sound at the door, the unmistakable creak of it opening. I turned, my stomach dropping as Samantha walked in. Her eyes moved between us, confusion quickly giving way to suspicion. "What's going on here?" she demanded, her voice sharp. Henry shot to his feet, his face pale. "Sam, this isn't what it looks like," he stammered, but the damage was done. The tension in the room was unbearable, and I knew there was no way this was going to end well. Samantha's presence shifted the room's energy completely. Her piercing gaze darted between Henry and me, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. I could see the questions swirling in her mind, the anger simmering just beneath the surface. Meanwhile, Henry stood frozen, like a deer caught in headlights, unable to muster a single word to defend himself. "Well," she demanded, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "What exactly am I interrupting here?" I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. How could I possibly explain this? Henry, still visibly shaken, tried to step toward her. "Sam, please just hear me out." "Hear you out?" she snapped, her tone dripping with disbelief. "You're standing in our neighbor's living room in the middle of the night, and you expect me to just calmly listen?" Her voice trembled, and I could see the pain in her eyes. Whatever illusion she had about her marriage was crumbling before her eyes. But it wasn't just her pain that filled the room. It was the unspoken truth, the weight of Henry's confession, and the undeniable tension that lingered between us. Henry ran a hand through his hair, his voice barely audible. "It's not what you think." "Oh, really?" Samantha's voice rose. "Because it sure looks like you've been hiding something from me, Henry." And judging by the look on her face, she gestured toward me. "It's something big." I felt my cheeks flush with embarrassment and guilt. I hadn't done anything wrong, but being pulled into this mess made me feel complicit. "Samantha, I started, but she cut me off. "Don't," she said, her voice breaking. "Don't even try to defend him. I deserve the truth." Henry looked at her, his face pale and full of regret. "Sam, I've been struggling," he admitted. "Struggling with feelings I can't explain. Feelings I've tried to fight." Samantha stared at him, her jaw tightening. "Feelings for her?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mix of hurt and fury. Henry didn't answer right away, and the silence spoke louder than words. Finally, he nodded. "I never meant for it to get this far," he said quietly. "I never meant to hurt you. You never meant to hurt me?" Samantha's voice cracked, and tears welled up in her eyes. "Henry, you've destroyed everything. How long has this been going on?" "There's nothing going on," I blurted out, desperate to clear my name. I had no idea he felt this way. I didn't ask for any of this. Samantha turned to me, her eyes narrowing. "You didn't ask for it? Then why are you here? Why did he feel comfortable enough to come to you with this?" I didn't have an answer for her. I felt trapped, caught in a storm I had no control over. Henry tried to step in, his voice pleading. "Sam, this isn't her fault. It's mine. I've been lost, confused. I didn't know who else to turn to." Samantha let out a bitter laugh. "So instead of coming to your wife, the person you're supposed to trust the most, you decided to pour your heart out to our neighbor." Henry's face crumpled, and for the first time, I saw the full weight of his guilt. "I know I messed up," he said, his voice shaking. "But I didn't want to hurt you more by saying these things to you." "Oh well, you've done a great job of that," Samantha snapped. "You've kept your feelings bottled up, let them fester, and now you've dragged her into it too. Do you even care about what you've done to us?" "To me." Henry reached for her, but she stepped back, her face hardening. "Don't," she said coldly. "Don't touch me. Don't say another word. I can't even look at you right now." The room fell into an uneasy silence, the kind that makes your skin crawl. Samantha's tears were falling freely now, but she didn't bother wiping them away. She turned to me again, her voice quieter but no less sharp. "And you? I don't know what role you've played in this, but don't think you're innocent. You should have pushed him away the second he walked through that door." I nodded, unable to argue. She wasn't wrong. I should have done more to stop this before it spiraled out of control. But now it was too late. The damage was done. Without another word, Samantha turned on her heel and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her. Henry collapsed onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, I thought about leaving, about walking out the door and pretending this night never happened. But deep down, I knew that wasn't possible. This was only the beginning, and things were about to get much worse. The door slammed behind Samantha, leaving the air in the room thick and suffocating. Henry sat motionless on the couch, his face buried in his hands. I stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to distance myself from this mess before it consumed me entirely, but something kept me rooted to the spot. "I've ruined everything," Henry muttered, his voice muffled and strained. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." I stayed silent, unsure of what to say. What could I possibly offer that would fix this situation? Nothing I said or did could undo the damage that had been done. Still, I felt compelled to speak. "Henry, you need to fix this," I said, my voice low but firm. "You need to talk to her, to explain everything. Sitting here isn't going to make it better." He lifted his head, his eyes bloodshot and hollow. "Explain what? That I've been harboring feelings for someone else? That I've destroyed the one good thing in my life? What could I possibly say to make this right?" Before I could respond, there was another knock at the door. My heart sank. Samantha again? Or worse, someone else who'd been dragged into this mess? The knock came again, harder this time, more insistent. I exchanged a nervous glance with Henry before moving toward the door. My hand hovered over the doorknob for a moment, dread pooling in my stomach, and then I opened it. Samantha stood there, but she wasn't alone. A tall man stood behind her, his presence commanding and unyielding. His sharp features and piercing gaze immediately made it clear he wasn't here for a friendly chat. Samantha's face was tear-streaked, but her expression was hardened with determination. "This is Luke," she said, her voice trembling slightly but laced with anger. "My brother." Henry shot up from the couch, his face draining of color. "Sam, what are you doing?" he stammered. Luke stepped forward, his eyes locked on Henry. "You think you can just toy with my sister's life and get away with it?" he said, his tone calm but lethal. "You've already done enough damage, and I'm here to make sure it stops." "Luke, please," Henry began, but Luke cut him off with a sharp gesture. "No, you don't get to talk your way out of this," Luke said. "I've been watching you, Henry. For weeks. I know everything." My stomach churned. This wasn't just a confrontation anymore. It was a reckoning. Henry's face twisted in confusion and panic. "What do you mean, everything?" Samantha crossed her arms, her gaze cold and unrelenting. "He's been following you, Henry. Watching you sneak out late at night, making excuses, lying. We knew something was going on, but now we have proof." "Proof?" Henry's voice cracked, and his eyes flicked between Samantha and Luke. "What are you talking about?" Luke pulled out his phone and tapped the screen a few times before holding it up. "This," he said, showing the screen to Henry. I couldn't see what it was, but Henry's reaction said it all. His face turned pale, and his shoulders sagged as if the weight of the world had just crushed him. "You've been lying to her for months," Luke said, his voice steady but filled with venom. "Sneaking around, keeping secrets. And then, tonight, you crossed a line you can't come back from." Henry's voice was barely a whisper. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." "You didn't mean for it to go this far?" Samantha snapped, her voice rising. "Henry, you've been betraying me, our marriage, for months. And now you're standing here, acting like you're the victim?" Henry looked at her, his eyes filled with desperation. "Sam, I swear I never acted on anything. I never." "Don't," she interrupted, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and heartbreak. "Don't try to downplay this. Don't insult me like that." The room felt like it was about to explode with tension. Every word, every glance, every silence was a dagger, cutting deeper into an already bleeding wound. And then, as if things couldn't get any worse, Luke turned his attention to me. "And you," he said, his voice cold and unforgiving. "What's your excuse? You knew he was married. You knew this was wrong, and yet you let it happen." "I didn't," I stammered, feeling my chest tighten with panic. "I didn't know he felt this way until tonight. I didn't encourage him, I swear." Luke's gaze didn't waver. "You think that absolves you? You think just standing there and letting him pour his heart out makes you innocent? You're just as complicit as he is." "I didn't ask for any of this," I said, my voice trembling. "I didn't want to be involved." "But you are involved," Samantha interjected, her voice sharp. "You're in the middle of this now, whether you like it or not." The room fell into a heavy silence again, the kind that suffocates you, that presses down on your chest until you can't breathe. I wanted to run, to escape this nightmare, but there was no escaping the truth. Henry finally spoke, his voice breaking. "Sam, I'm sorry. I know I've hurt you, and I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." Samantha's eyes filled with tears, but her expression remained steely. "It's too late for that, Henry. You made your choice, and now you have to live with the consequences." Luke placed a hand on Samantha's shoulder, guiding her toward the door. "You'll be hearing from us," he said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "And trust me, you won't like what's coming." With that, they left, the door slamming shut behind them. Henry collapsed onto the couch, his head in his hands, while I stood there, my mind racing. The storm had come and gone, but the wreckage it left behind was overwhelming. Henry finally looked up at me, his eyes filled with despair. "What do I do now?" he asked, his voice barely audible. I shook my head, unable to find an answer. "I don't know, Henry. I don't know." We sat in silence, the weight of the night pressing down on us both. And though the door was closed, it felt like the world outside was closing in, ready to deliver the consequences of the choices we'd made. The silence after Samantha and Luke left was deafening. It was as if the air in the room had been sucked out, leaving only the heavy weight of regret and guilt behind. Henry sat slumped on the couch, his head buried in his hands, while I stood frozen, unsure of what to say or do. The gravity of what had just unfolded hung over us like a storm cloud. Henry finally broke the silence. "I've lost her," he muttered, his voice hollow and distant. "She's gone. She's really gone." I didn't know how to respond. What could I say? That everything would be okay? That he could fix this? Those words felt hollow, almost cruel, in the face of what had just happened. The truth was, I wasn't sure there was any way back from this for him. Or for me. "You need to talk to her," I said quietly, breaking the unbearable tension. "Even if she's angry, even if she doesn't want to listen, you owe her that much." Henry looked up at me, his eyes red and filled with despair. "She won't listen. Not now. Not after this." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "You can't just sit here and do nothing, Henry. You have to try. You owe it to her, to yourself." He nodded slowly, but there was no conviction in his movements. He looked like a man defeated, someone who had already resigned himself to his fate. "I don't even know where to start," he admitted. "I don't know how to fix this." As much as I wanted to help, I knew this wasn't my battle to fight. I'd been dragged into this mess unwillingly, but the consequences weren't mine to bear. Not entirely, at least. Henry's choices had led him here, and now he had to face the fallout. "I think you need to leave," I said, my voice firm but not unkind. "Staying here isn't going to help. You need to figure out what you want and how to fix things with Samantha." Henry's gaze shifted to the floor, and for a moment, I thought he might argue. But then he nodded, a quiet acceptance of the truth he didn't want to face. "You're right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need to go." He stood, grabbing his jacket from the back of the couch. As he moved toward the door, he paused and turned to face me. "Thank you," he said, his tone earnest. "For listening. For letting me, I don't know, get this out. I'm sorry for dragging you into this." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I didn't feel like I deserved his thanks, but I also didn't have the energy to argue. As he walked out the door, I felt a strange mix of relief and guilt. Relief that he was gone, that I could finally breathe again. Guilt because, no matter how much I told myself I wasn't to blame, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was complicit in this chaos. But the fallout was far from over. The next few days were a blur of tension and unease. I avoided going outside, afraid of running into Samantha or Luke, or worse, the rest of the neighborhood catching wind of the scandal. Every knock at the door, every ring of my phone sent a jolt of panic through me. The weight of what had happened lingered like a dark shadow, refusing to let me move on. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, there was another knock at my door. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, pretending I wasn't home. But the knocking grew more insistent, and eventually, I forced myself to answer it. Standing on my doorstep was Samantha. Her eyes were puffy and red, her expression a mixture of anger and sadness. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. "I need to talk to you," she said finally, her voice steady despite the raw emotion behind it. I stepped aside, letting her in. She stood in the middle of my living room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, as if she was trying to hold herself together. I could see the hurt in her eyes, the betrayal she was struggling to process. "I don't know what Henry told you," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "but I need to know the truth. I need to hear it from you." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Samantha, I swear I didn't know he felt this way until that night. He came here unannounced and dropped all of this on me. I didn't encourage him. I didn't." She held up a hand, cutting me off. "I don't care about excuses," she said sharply. "I just want to know one thing. Did anything happen between you two?" "No," I said firmly, meeting her gaze. "Nothing happened. I wouldn't let it." She studied me for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether I was telling the truth. Finally, she nodded, though the tension in her shoulders didn't ease. "I don't know if I believe you," she admitted. "But I'm too tired to argue. I wanted to say something, to offer some kind of comfort, but I knew it wouldn't make a difference." Samantha wasn't looking for reassurance. She was looking for closure, for a way to make sense of the chaos her life had become. "I don't know what's going to happen," she said quietly, more to herself than to me. "But I know one thing. Henry doesn't deserve me." With that, she turned and walked out, leaving me alone once again. As the door closed behind her, I couldn't help but feel the weight of her words. She was right. Henry didn't deserve her. But I wasn't sure anyone deserved the pain this situation had caused. The fallout of that night would linger for a long time. And though I wanted to believe it was over, deep down, I knew this was just the beginning. In the days that followed, the chaos began to settle, but the weight of everything that had happened still lingered like a heavy fog. Henry never came back to my doorstep, and I didn't see Samantha again after her visit. It felt like the silence between us all was both a relief and a punishment. A reminder that some things can't simply be undone or forgotten. Life in the neighborhood resumed its usual rhythm, but it felt different now. The once peaceful quiet carried an undercurrent of tension, as if the walls themselves were holding on to the secrets that had unfolded within them. I tried to focus on my routine, to bury myself in work and pretend like everything was normal, but my mind kept drifting back to that night. To Henry's confession. To Samantha's pain. To my own role in the unraveling of their marriage. I couldn't shake the feeling of guilt. Even though I hadn't reciprocated Henry's feelings or acted on them, I felt complicit in the chaos. Maybe I could have stopped him earlier, set clearer boundaries, or been more decisive in shutting him down. But hindsight, as they say, is always 20/20ths. What was done, and now we all had to live with the consequences. A week later, I heard from a mutual neighbor that Samantha had moved out. She had taken most of her belongings and left the house she'd shared with Henry, leaving him to grapple with the empty shell of their former life. I wasn't surprised. In fact, I couldn't blame her. How do you rebuild trust after something like that? How do you look at someone who betrayed you and still see the person you thought you knew? Henry, on the other hand, became a ghost. I'd occasionally see him through the window, sitting alone in his dimly lit living room. He looked like a man weighed down by his choices, by the wreckage of his life. A part of me wanted to feel sorry for him, but another part knew this was the result of his own actions. He had made his choices, and now he was living with the fallout. As for me, I learned a hard lesson about boundaries and the importance of guarding my peace. When Henry knocked on my door that night, I opened it out of kindness, thinking I was doing the right thing. But kindness, I realized, doesn't mean sacrificing your own well-being or becoming entangled in someone else's chaos. It's important to set limits, to recognize when a situation is spiraling into something you can't and shouldn't control. I also found myself reflecting on Samantha's words during her visit. "Henry doesn't deserve me," she had said. And she was right. No one deserves to be betrayed, to have their trust shattered by someone they love. But in those words, I also saw her strength, the strength to walk away, to choose herself over a broken relationship. That, I realized, was the real resolution to this story. Samantha's decision to value her own worth over someone else's mistakes. The experience left me with a newfound appreciation for the fragility of trust and the importance of honesty in relationships. It's easy to take people for granted, to assume that love will weather any storm. But without communication, without effort, even the strongest bonds can break. As time passed, the scars of that night began to fade, but the lessons remained. I resolved to be more mindful of the people I let into my life, to protect my boundaries fiercely, and to recognize that not every cry for help is mine to answer. Sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is to let them figure it out on their own. Looking back, I can't say I'm grateful for what happened, but I am grateful for what it taught me. Life doesn't come with a roadmap, and sometimes we find ourselves in situations we never imagined. But it's in those moments, in the choices we make and the lessons we learn, that we truly discover who we are. If you were in Samantha's shoes, what would you have done? Could you ever forgive such a betrayal? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more shocking, real-life stories that will leave you speechless. Trust me, the next one will have you questioning everything you think you know about love and trust. Stay tuned.